There's this part in the Bible, in Genesis, that just leaves people scratching their heads. It's only a few verses long, but it opens up a whole world of questions. We're talking about Genesis chapter 6, right before the big flood. It mentions these figures called Nephilim, and right away your mind probably jumps to giants. But what does that really mean? What was going on there? It's a mystery that people have talked about for thousands of years. The text itself is pretty short and to the point. It starts by saying that people began to multiply on the earth, and they had daughters. Then it gets interesting. It says, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. This is where things get complicated. Who exactly were these sons of God? And who were the daughters of man? After that, God speaks, saying his spirit won't stay with humans forever. He says their days will be 120 years. That's a whole other discussion, but it's part of the context of this strange event. And then comes the really puzzling part. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So, we have these three key elements: sons of God, daughters of man, and Nephilim. And they're all tangled up together. The Nephilim are described as mighty men and men of renown. And they were on the earth not just before the flood, but also afterward. That's a big detail we'll have to come back to. Let's break down these pieces and see what different ideas people have had about them. Because, honestly, there isn't one simple answer everyone agrees on. One of the biggest questions is about the sons of God. Who were they? There are two main views, and then some smaller ones. The first main idea is that the sons of God were fallen angels. This view sees the phrase sons of God, or Bene Elohim in Hebrew, as referring to spiritual beings, specifically angels. You can see this term used for angels in other parts of the Old Testament, like in the book of Job, where the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. If these sons of God were angels, then the story in Genesis 6 means that some angels actually left their spiritual realm, took on physical bodies, and had children with human women. This sounds pretty wild, right? But some people point to other Bible verses that seem to support this. For example, the book of Jude talks about angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling. It says God has kept them in eternal chains under gloomy darkness for the judgment of the great day. And 2 Peter also mentions angels who sin, saying God cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. Many see these verses as talking about the very angels who committed this sin in Genesis 6. So, if angels had children with humans, what would that make the offspring? It would make them a kind of hybrid being. Not fully human, not fully angelic. And that's where the Nephilim come in. They would be these strange, unnatural beings born from this forbidden union. This view often connects the Nephilim to the idea of giants, suggesting they were exceptionally large or powerful due to their mixed heritage. They would be mighty men, and men of renown because they were different, possessing unusual strength or abilities. This angelic view helps explain why God's judgment was so severe. It wasn't just human wickedness, but a direct attack on the created order, a corruption of the human lineage itself. It explains why God felt he had to wipe out almost everyone with the flood, to cleanse the earth of this profound defilement. The idea is that these angel-human hybrids would have spread a kind of spiritual and physical corruption that was deeply offensive to God. But there are some big questions that come up with this view. The most common one is from Matthew chapter 22, verse 30, where Jesus says that in the resurrection, people neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. This seems to suggest that angels don't have sex or procreate. So how could they have children with human women? People who hold the angel view have different ways of answering this. Some say that Jesus was talking about holy angels in heaven, not fallen angels. They argue that fallen angels, having rebelled against God, might have also rebelled against their natural order, including their inability to procreate. They might have taken on physical bodies specifically for this purpose, to corrupt humanity. Others say that Mary in Matthew refers to the institution of marriage as humans know it, not necessarily the act of procreation itself. It's a tricky point. Another question is how spiritual beings could take on physical form and then physically procreate. The Bible doesn't give us all the details on how angels work, so it leaves room for interpretation. Angels did appear in physical forms in other parts of the Bible, like the angels who visited Abraham or the 2 angels in Sodom. They ate, and even had bodies that could be physically threatened. So the idea of them having physical forms isn't entirely new. But procreation is a step further. Now, let's look at the second main view of the sons of God. This one says they were not angels at all, but human beings. Specifically, they were the descendants of Seth. This is often called the Sethite view. To understand this, we need to go back a few chapters in Genesis. After Cain killed Abel, and Cain was cast out, Adam and Eve had another son named Seth. The Bible says that Seth was born in his own likeness, after his image, meaning he carried the human line that was meant to worship God. The descendants of Seth are often seen as the righteous line, the ones who called upon the name of the Lord, meaning they were devoted to God. In contrast, the descendants of Cain were generally seen as wicked, marked by violence and selfishness. So in the Sethite view, the sons of God are the men from the righteous line of Seth, and the daughters of man are the women from the unrighteous, wicked line of Cain. The sin in this interpretation isn't about angels interbreeding with humans. It's about the righteous line of Seth intermarrying with the unrighteous line of Cain. They saw that the daughters of man were attractive and chose them as wives, essentially compromising their faith and purity by forming alliances with the wicked. This kind of intermarriage was forbidden for God's people later in the Bible to keep them from being led astray by pagan practices. So, this view sees Genesis 6 as an early example of this principle. The sons of God, Sethites, were meant to maintain a distinct godly culture, but they blurred the lines. They fell for physical attractiveness and worldly appeal instead of seeking partners who shared their devotion to God. What does this make the Nephilim then, if they were the offspring of these marriages? In this view, the Nephilim would not be hybrids in the supernatural sense. They would be powerful, tyrannical, perhaps physically strong humans who rose to prominence because of this mixing of lines. They were mighty men, and men of renown in a negative sense. They were famous for their power, their violence, their selfish ambition. They became heroes of their age, but not in a good way. They represented the peak of human wickedness and oppression, which contributed to God's decision to flood the earth. The Sethite view makes the whole story more contained within human history and human sin. It doesn't require angels to take on physical bodies and procreate, which avoids the conflict with Jesus' statement about angels not marrying. It shows the progressive corruption of humanity, where even the good line eventually gave in to worldly desires, leading to total depravity. Where God's judgment of the flood becomes a judgment on humanity's widespread moral decay, which included this spiritual compromise. But this view also has its questions. If it was just intermarriage between two human groups, why does the Bible use such specific and unusual language? Why sons of God if they were just Sethites? And why would their offspring, the Nephilim, be described in such a unique way, implying something distinct or extraordinary beyond just powerful people? It seems to diminish the special nature of the Nephilim if they were simply the result of common human intermarriage. It also doesn't fully explain the exceptional wickedness that led to the flood as powerfully as the idea of an angelic corruption does. There's a third, less common view that suggests the sons of God were powerful, tyrannical rulers or kings who oppressed others and had many wives, fathering mighty men in their image. This view often ties into the idea of ancient Near Eastern kings claiming divine lineage. But this explanation doesn't usually delve into the Nephilim as much as the other two, so we'll focus mostly on the angel and Sethite views. Now, let's talk more about the Nephilim themselves. What does that word even mean? The Hebrew word Nephilim comes from the root nephal, which means to fall. So, some interpret Nephilim as the fallen ones. This could mean fallen angels, or the offspring of fallen angels, or even just humans who have fallen from grace into wickedness. It could also mean those who fall upon others, implying violence and oppression. The verse also explicitly says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. And it describes them as the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The connection to giants comes from several places. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, translates Nephilim as gigantes, which means giant. This translation influenced how people understood the word for a long time. So, the idea of them being physically huge, imposing figures became very common. If the sons of God were fallen angels, then the Nephilim being literal giants or hybrid beings makes a lot of sense. Their extraordinary size or power would be a direct result of their unnatural origin. They would be distinct from regular humans, a new kind of entity on Earth. This would also make them men of renown because of their unique, powerful, and probably fearsome nature. They would be remembered for their strength and perhaps their destructive acts. If the sons of God were Sethites, then the Nephilim being giants might be understood more metaphorically. They could be giants, in terms of their influence, power, or wickedness. They were leading figures, but in a bad way. They might have been physically large, but not necessarily supernatural hybrids. Perhaps they were just strong, imposing human warriors or rulers who dominated the weak. They were mighty men and men of renown, because they were famous and powerful, but notorious for their evil. Regardless of their specific origin, the Nephilim played a role in the increasing wickedness on earth. Genesis 6 continues right after these verses by saying, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And this moved God to grief. He was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and his heart was grieved." He decided to wipe out humanity, along with all living creatures, from the face of the earth. So the Nephilim phenomenon, whatever its exact nature, was part of the overall picture of total human depravity that provoked God's judgment of the flood. They were either a direct cause of a specific grave corruption angelic view, or a symptom and embodiment of general human sin and oppression, Sethite view. Either way, they represented a severe problem that needed addressing. Now, let's get to that really tricky part. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The "in" those days refers to the time before the flood, but an "also afterward" implies that they reappeared or continued to exist after the flood. This is a huge challenge for anyone who believes the flood completely wiped out all life outside of Noah's Ark. If the Nephilim were supernatural hybrids, how could they have survived the flood? The Bible clearly states that every living thing that was on the face of the ground was destroyed. If they were hybrids, they should have died too. And if they were just wicked humans, they also should have perished. So, what does an "also afterward" mean? This is where the two main views often diverge significantly in their explanations. For those who hold the angelic view of the sons of God and the hybrid nature of the Nephilim, the "and also afterward" is often explained in a couple of ways. One explanation is that the term Nephilim simply became a general descriptor for exceptionally large, powerful, and formidable people who appeared after the flood. So, the pre-flood Nephilim, the actual hybrids, were wiped out, but then later, people like the Anakim, the Rephaim, and other giants mentioned in the Old Testament were called Nephilim because they shared similar characteristics, great size, strength, and often a reputation for wickedness. This would mean Nephilim, after the flood, are not the same lineage or genetic makeup as the pre-flood ones, but simply a descriptive term. The original hybrid line was gone. Another, less common, explanation in the angelic view is that perhaps the fallen angels repeated their sin after the flood. This would mean a second incursion. However, there's no clear biblical evidence to support this idea. The passages in Jude and Peter seem to imply that the angels involved in the Genesis 6 event were chained up and prevented from repeating their sin. So, the second incursion idea is not widely accepted. For those who hold the Sethite view, where the Nephilim were just powerful human tyrants, the entire incurgency, and also afterward, is a bit easier to explain. The flood wiped out all humans except Noah's family. So, any giants or mighty men after the flood would simply be regular human descendants of Noah's family who grew to be very large or powerful. The term Nephilim in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33 would just be a reference to a specific group of very large, formidable people. It would be a descriptive term, not necessarily indicating a supernatural origin. The Anakim, who were mentioned alongside the Nephilim in Numbers, were clearly human, though very large. Let's look at that verse in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, because it's the other explicit mention of Nephilim in the Bible. When the Israelite spies went into Canaan, they came back with a scary report. They said, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are part of the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." This verse clearly connects the Nephilim with the Anakim, who were a known group of tall, strong people living in Canaan. Other passages in the Old Testament talk about different groups of giants, like the Rephaim, the Emim, and the Zamzummim. These are all described as human ethnic groups, though often remarkably large. Goliath, for instance, was a Philistine giant. He was a human, albeit an extremely large and powerful one. So, the simplest way to understand it also afterward is that Nephilim became a general term. It referred to these intimidating, large, warrior-like people who inhabited the land of Canaan before the Israelites took it over. They weren't necessarily the same genetic type as the pre-flood Nephilim, if those were hybrids. They were just big, powerful humans. The spies used the term Nephilim to instill fear, reminding the Israelites of those fearsome stories from the past. It was a term that evoked dread, whether it meant an actual hybrid or simply a terrifyingly large human. This understanding helps maintain the consistency of the flood narrative, where all life outside the ark perished. It also means that even if the pre-flood Nephilim were a unique hybrid race, that race was extinguished. The post-flood Nephilim were simply human lines that produced formidable individuals. But why would the Bible use such a mysterious and loaded term like Nephilim for these later giants if they were just big humans? This is where the debate comes full circle. For some, the very fact that the spies used the term Nephilim suggests that there was something profoundly unsettling about these post-flood giants too. It implies a continuation of a certain type of corrupted strength or evil, whether supernatural or not. The theological implications of this story are huge, no matter which view you lean towards. First, it shows the devastating effects of sin and rebellion against God. Whether it was angels crossing boundaries or humans corrupting their lineage, the result was a profound wickedness that permeated all of society. Second, it highlights God's holiness and his unyielding stance against sin. His grief over humanity's condition and his decision to bring the flood demonstrate the seriousness with which he views moral corruption and the violation of his created order. Third, it sets the stage for God's plan of redemption. In the midst of all this darkness, Noah is found righteous. God preserves a pure line through Noah and his family, showing his grace and his commitment to his covenant. This story is a crucial part of the backstory leading up to God's continued work with humanity and eventually the coming of Christ. Fourth, it points to the mysterious nature of the spiritual realm and its interaction with the human world. Even if you hold the Sethite view, the spiritual battle is still evident in human choices. But if you hold the angelic view, it reveals a more direct spiritual warfare happening, where dark spiritual forces actively try to corrupt and destroy God's creation. Humanity is prone to severe corruption when it turns away from God. God's judgment is real and serious when sin reaches its peak. But God's grace always provides a way for those who remain faithful, like Noah. So, to come back to the original question, what were the Nephilim in Genesis 6? They were the offspring of a mysterious union between sons of God and daughters of man. They were called mighty men and men of renown, often associated with the idea of giants. One strong idea is that they were hybrid beings born from fallen angels, mating with human women, leading to a unique, powerful, and deeply corrupted race that contributed to the total depravity before the flood. In this view, the pre-flood Nephilim were wiped out, and the post-flood Nephilim were merely very large, powerful humans who were called by the same fearsome name. Another strong idea is that they were the powerful, tyrannical offspring of righteous human men, Sethites intermarrying with wicked human women, Cainites, symbolizing the complete moral decay of humanity. In this view, the term Nephilim referred to these formidable, oppressive human figures, both before and after the flood, who were giants in stature, power, or both. The Bible doesn't explicitly resolve all the details, leaving room for careful study and interpretation. What's clear is that the Nephilim represented a significant problem in the eyes of God, contributing to the extreme wickedness that led to the flood. They were a vivid example of how far humanity, and perhaps even spiritual beings, could fall from God's intended order. And the memory of these formidable figures, whether hybrid or simply massive humans, continue to strike fear into the hearts of people even centuries later, as seen in the spies' report from Canaan. It's a passage that keeps us thinking, reminds us of the power of ancient stories, and points to the complex tapestry of the Bible's unfolding narrative about God, humanity, and sin.